Hi guys. Today's topic is about business culture in the Western world. The cluster devised by the Globe project, which were presented in topic 2, will be the starting point for this and the following topic. This will take aspect of each of the Globe cluster relating to history, geography, languages, religion, and work-related values and practices, and will feature certain countries within each cluster. There are two learning objectives in this topic, and I hope that by the end of this topic, you should be able to first understand the European cultures, and second, understand the American and Australian Asian culture. Before describing the business cultures in the Western world, it is important to highlight the phenomenon multiculturalism, and also called ethnic diversity, which embodied a profound change in post-industrial society. This society, which represents a Western-centric economics concept, appeared at the beginning of the 70s when, for the first time, the service sector contributed more to the wealth of a number of countries than manufacturing sector. Because of its history, the United States is considered to be the best example of this development. However, multiculturalism is no longer preserved of Western societies. Countries such as Brazil and Mexico have also had ethnic minorities for a long time. There are two approaches to the concept of multiculturalism. Political and economic factors have encouraged wave of immigration from one country to another, from one culture to another. The immigrants may be confronted with enormous differences at all levels of culture and need in some way or other to adapt. On the other hand, those cultures receiving the immigrants may well find that a certain process of accommodation is required to enable the process of integration. This integration process is at the heart of the multicultural issue. Scholars argue that in the United States, it is the mass culture that has been the major factor for the integration of immigrants coming from countries more distant from the European cradle. For this group, middle class values were involved in the process of acculturation, that is, psychosocial adaptation of newcomers. The value which made up of a strong frame of references necessary when becoming familiar with their new home. Joining a dominant culture, however, has entailed this group giving up their own culture and recognizing only one culture, that of the white middle of European origin, as representative of the culture of Middle America. So, how can multiculturalism be addressed? Conceptually, there are two major schools of thought which are opposed to each other and even contradict each other, according to whether they promote a system of values belonging to monocultural or multicultural society. In this table, we can see how the approaches differ with regard to the vision of the world, particularly their conception of the role of the human in a society. While the monocultural vision is illustrated by the metaphor of the melting pot, an optimistic and homogeneous process of integration. The multicultural vision is evoked by the image of the salad bowl, representing the coexistence of a mosaic of culture with each other maintain their own particularities. As aforementioned, this topic based on the globe cultural cluster, but in specific, seek cluster which with Western cultures such as Eastern Europe, Latin America, Latin Europe, Anglo, Germany, and Nordic. The remaining four clusters will be covered on the next topic. Okay, we will start with the European cultures. Europe is generally considered to be a community that is neither racially nor linguistically based, but rather created on the event of its history. Although Europe is traditionally designated as one of the world's seven continents, its contours appear for the first time on a world map in 100 to 160 AD. Its identity has never been clearly established either culturally, politically, or geographically. Current Europe eastern border in particular remains somewhat arbitrary, since this can also be seen as a part of Asia. Not having ever been a stable, autonomous entity, Europe has been portrayed in many different ways down the ages according to the cultural and political relation prevailing. The most recent development in terms of relation within Europe is the European Union, EU. The Council of Europe and the European Union were both set up in order to bring peace and prosperity to a continent whose countries had been at war with each other. The Council has come to play a special role in the development of the EU by laying down economic, social, and legal benchmark for new applicant countries. By doing so, it is creating a European identity based on common values and practices. However, to what extent can one talk of a European culture based on such value and practices? There is certainly an increasing uniformity in the way affairs are organized and in the way people run their life, particularly thanks to the effect of the EU relating to the socio-economic domain. The Schengen Agreement, for example, allows free movement of persons within the majority of EU countries. This map shows the classifications of regions within Europe, with each cluster has its own differences. We will then discuss a few countries from different clusters in order to compare and contrast their differences. First, we have Greece in the Western Europe. Why it is not possible to talk about Europe without mentioning Greece? Historically speaking, Greek civilization had a strong influence on the Romans, and through the Latin language, the Western world absorbed Greek culture. In contemporary terms, Greece, which became the 10th member of the EU in 1988, featured heavily in a recent major economic crisis involving in the banking sector. Greece would have been bankrupt in 2011 if the state of the Eurozone and the International Monetary Fund had not procured its financial assistance. To try and understand why Greece ended up in this extreme situation, we can refer to the analysis of Greek culture made by the Globe Project. And Greece show a low scale in future orientation in both as if and should be level. This is reflected in their attitude towards the future orientation dimension, where the Greeks are shown to be unwilling to make long-term plans. Nonetheless, when Greece was integrated into the EU and the European currency system, its government was asked okay, to adapt its practices in order to act in a more future-oriented way. Next, we have France. Unlike the other countries in Latin Europe, France was formed by a wide range of people, consisting at the start mainly of Celts, the Gauls, Romans, and Germans. In the 18th century, France became the model of European culture, not only through the dissemination of the universal values that are liberty, equality, and fraternity, proclaimed during the French Revolution, but also through its language. It is perhaps the historical role of France as the upholder of universal cultural values that has made it reluctant to envisage a plurality of culture or to talk of one culture for one people. In any case, the French idea of universal culture and its concept of a unity of cultural communities within French society contrasts strongly with the notion held in other European countries of a national culture essentially based on compromise. Another distinctive feature of France, that is, compared to its neighbor, lies in its history as an all-immigration country. Although European people migrated to various parts of the world to populate the colonies and the new countries, France took in more immigrants than the number of French people who went abroad. Nowadays, almost a quarter of the population has at least one of his or her four grandparents born in a foreign country. Therefore, it is difficult to talk about the identity of France without referring to the cultural diversity of its original and immigrant peoples. In the economic sphere, the number of companies with a state-owned majority shareholding, such as Renault, Air France, and France Telecom, as well as the number of employees working in a public company, have been declining in all sectors in the last centuries. Indeed, it has often been necessary to privatize enterprises in order to facilitate their growth through acquisitions or mergers with other European and global private companies. The state used to develop regulation concerning foreign ownership either to protect some large industrial companies against a hostile takeover bid or to preserve their national character. Currently, although its participation already has greatly diminished, the state continues to sell its shares, particularly those in state-owned enterprises. Next, we have Germanic Europe. Germanic countries show lower power distance than their fellow Europeans. This is reflected in a general preferences for company employees to work in groups rather than making solo effort. The concern for detailed codes and written rules could be seen as reflecting Hofstadt's dimension of uncertainty avoidance. German companies rely heavily on experts and their knowledge to minimize insecurity, and for the same reason, they tend to adopt a long-term perspective when making strategic decisions. It was Germanic peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, and Jews, who, along with other tribes from northern Europe, settled in large number of Britannia, the province that Romans had established on the lowlands of the British mainland and later abandoned. With the eventual consolidation of the various settlements and kingdoms, this area became known as England. England eventually became the dominant part of larger political entity now known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which includes Wales, Scotland, and the northern part of the Isle of Ireland. The use of the term British reflects the union of the peoples of this extreme western part of Europe and the amalgam of elements that constitute their culture. Because of the ethnic and linguistic similarity, the Globe project placed these countries in the Anglo cluster along with North America and Australasia. However, because of its common history with Europe, we will consider in this section Great Britain as being a country in the Western European cluster, even though its style of management is Anglo-Saxon. Using Hofstad's cultural dimension, the British can be characterized as having less power distance and lower uncertainty avoidance than their European neighbors, while at the same time being more individualistic and more ambiguous and aggressive than their counterpart on the continent. The relaxed British approach to management contrasts strongly with the Latin and Nordic approach. The British is highly individual-oriented. The job is a job, regarded as separate from one's personal life, a task to be performed impersonally. This can be seen in the way personnel are selected. Although the selection process may appear the same across European countries, the emphasis in British culture is on the extent to which the individual concerned can contribute to the task of the organization. That is, why it is normal for intelligence and skill to be measured and assessment centers to be employed. The UK joined the former European Union in 1973 but had officially left the European Union last year, 2020. The Globe researchers have placed most of the former communist countries in the Eastern Europe cluster, rather than including the countries there in one of the Western European cluster. It is clear that the aftermath of the Second World War involved Europe being divided in two, with Eastern Europe becoming closed off, thrown back on itself, and dependent on Soviet communism. Western Europe, on the other hand, fell under the very strong influence of the United States. Its enterprising mind, its stay for race, and championing of individual rights. However, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 9 November 1989, Western and Eastern Europe were no longer separated, and the restructuring of the East German economy began, along with that of the Soviet Union and the satellite state of the Communist bloc. Another incongruity in the Globe project classification is that Turkey, which is placed in the Middle East cluster, has been an associate member of the European Union since 1963 and is striving to become a full member. Although the economies of the Eastern and Central European countries, including Russia and Turkey, have been growing rapidly, these countries have some similarity with other countries around the world, which are called emerging markets. Emerging markets are countries which are in transition phase from developing to developed markets due to rapid growth and industrialization. With the political collapse of the Soviet Union, 15 republics emerged, of which Russia itself is a collection of smaller republics, hence its official name, the Russian Federation. This new country, which spanned Europe and Asia, has also been struggling since 1991 to replace the social, political, and economic features of the communist era with a more democratic political system and a market-oriented economy. Close association with the EU is seen as an important way of developing the Russian economy. But membership is a step too far for many Russians who fear their independence being swallowed up in a greater Europe. So, is the country really a European nation? If, in geographic terms, the border of Europe is considered to be the Urals mountain range, can that part of Russia to the west of the Urals and where most of the population is centered be considered as European Russia? In economic terms, Russia not only belongs to the category of European emerging market, but it is also classified as one of the BRIC countries, along with emerging countries from other continents, Brazil, plus India and China. The BRIC countries are seen as rapidly developing with the potential to overshoot the world's largest economies in the future. Although the EU and Russia have been exploring the idea of developing a common European economic space, competing political and economic aims and interests appear to have gained the upper hand. Even if Russia's presence on the European business stage is becoming increasingly dominant, there are many who question whether Russians have the same regard for essential values such as democracy, human rights, and freedom as countries in and close to the European Union. Russia and Europe, they argue, are unlikely ever to share such cultural values. With the increased uncertainties of post-Soviet reforms, blood has continued to flourish, essentially to reduce the uncertainty nature of a society where service at social, educational, financial, and legal levels are weak, scarce, and non-existent. Turkey, on the other hand, is often seen as the bridge or crossroad between Europe and Asia. Its largest and most populated part, together with its capital, Ankara, lies in Asia, its smaller western part in Europe. The country's largest city, Istanbul, straddles the Bosphorus, the traditional border between Europe and Asia. Although negotiations for it to become a full member of the European Union begin in 2005, a number of European Union countries have made it clear that they do not consider that Turkey will be a suitable member. Their one fundamental concern is that Turkey is not European, either culturally or geographically. Proponents of Turkey membership argue that the country is European. It is successor state to which partitioned Ottoman Empire, which stretched from the Red Sea to the gates of Vienna and included most of southeastern Europe. As such, it played an influential role in the history of Europe for over 4 centuries. However, opponents maintain that if Turkey eventually becomes a full member of the EU, its large, mainly Muslim population would threaten the Judeo-Christian cultural homogeneity of the continent. We now move from the European cluster to the American and Australasian cluster. From an historical point of view, it would be more exact to say that we are moving from the European Old World to the New World. European peoples, first Portuguese and Spaniard, then the British, Dutch, French, and Swedish, brought their cultures to colonies that they founded on the American continent and called New Spain, New England, New Amsterdam, New France, New Sidon. It was also Europeans who set up New Holland, that is Australia, and New Zealand. We will thus focus on the cultures in the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand, where European colonies established trading settlements which evolved into formal colonies and eventually achieved independence. The original 13 British colonies in what would become the United States unilaterally declared that their independence of the British throne. This act of defiance led to the Revolutionary War between these colonies and Great Britain, the defeat of the mother country, and the eventual creation of the USA. Uniting the 13 colonies, now state, involved a constitutional convention, basically inventing a nation through devising a constitution and creating a suitable form of central government, all based on the principle of equality. A workable balance of power had to be established between a central authority and the state, who were proud of the independence they had enjoyed for many years. Within the government itself, the notion of equality was reflected in the way a number of institutions check and balance each other. A vital indicator of success for the United States businesses is the bottom line. Although financial results are crucial to all those pursuing business in the Anglo-Saxon way, Americans are much more concerned about the bottom line in the short term. This attitude engenders considerable criticism, especially among those who believe that investment of whatever kind often need time to bear fruit. On the other hand, United States companies are continually aware of the interests of shareholders. Money engenders money, and time is the key instrument. Time must be harnessed as effectively as possible to enable progress, advancement, and continuing commitment to the company. One clear difference that is frequently referred to when British and American businesses are being compared in the way they look at the future. The general optimism prevalent in the US businesses concerning the future and future success is said to contrast strongly with the more nuanced view of British business about future development. Until the 1960s, the main source of immigrants had been Europe. From then on, however, Latin America became the largest source, thanks to the easing of immigration law, the removal of national quotas, and the need for extra labor in the rapidly expanding economy of the United States. Latin America immigrants made up over 16% of the US population in 2011, equivalent to 52 million inhabitants. By that time, however, the numbers of immigrants from Asia, especially India, Japan, and South Korea, exceed even those of Latin America. Well, over half of the Mexican immigrants are to be found in California and Texas, states which share the 2,000-mile-long border with Mexico. The social and economic impact of these and other states and others where large number of Latin American immigrants have settled has been considerable. The complaints of the number of US citizens, especially in these areas, recall those made in previous century when large wave of German and Irish immigrants were thought to be a major threat to US society. Many of these comparatively recent immigrants are still undergoing the process of assimilation. One particular factor which adds a new dimension to the process is the fact that millions of Mexican immigrants live close to their mother country. Unlike the earlier immigrants from the Europe, Mexican livings in the USA can maintain close cultural ties with their mother country, and many choose to do so. This is facilitated by an abundance of Spanish language media. Even US companies make full use of this to promote their products and services, many of which are tuned to the needs and aspirations of the immigrants and their families. To add to this cross-cultural mixture, Mexican and even Brazilian companies have entered the market, taking advantage of the economic boom in their domestic market. Canada, originally the territory of the Indians and Inuit, was first explored by the French who set up their first colony around Quebec. The British also set up colonies, and it was they who eventually took control of Canada through settlement, warfare, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Although the British were to reign over a majority for 80 years, they formally granted Canadians the right to practice Catholic as well as French civil law through the Act of Quebec 1774. Canada may remain officially bilingual, English and French, but since 1971, the country has implemented a number of policies to address the increasing plurality of cultures resulting from the wave of immigrants from many parts of the world. It was in that year that then the Prime Minister proclaimed, "There is no official culture, nor does any ethnic group take precedence over any other. No citizen or group of citizens is other than Canadian, and all should be treated fairly." This statement boldly summarized the respect for cultural diversity and cultural pluralism, which was eventually enshrined in the Canadian Multiculturalism Act of 1988. This legislation has been a source of inspiration for other countries, coming to the term with diversity of cultures. Nevertheless, many Canadians are still concerned about who they actually are. Can Canadians be said to have a single national identity? One way of clarifying who you are is to try and ascertain who you are not. When dealing with Americans, Canadians are only too aware of the need to stand their own ground, to counter the tendency of Americans to assume that Canadians are just like them, despite the fact that they speak the same language, have some similar lifestyle, and share a similar frame of references. The Canadian style of management can contrast strongly to that of the United States in that it is less formalized, less driven by individual goals, and more aware of society as a whole. It is often considered to be more conservative in fiscal issues, and its expertise in financial management is well regarded internationally. Australia and New Zealand were both colonies of the United Kingdom. Britain claimed Australia as a colony in 1788, and New Zealand became a separate UK colony in 1840 after first being administered by the Australian state of the New South Wales. Of the early inhabitants of the remote part of the world, the Australian Aborigines and the New Zealand Maoris, were changed by the European settler. In Australia, these were first convicts from the UK and later free immigrants. In New Zealand, these were predominantly UK whalers and traders. When both countries become independent of the UK, they still retain their essential Anglo-Saxon identity. Further wave of British migrant when both countries became independent of the United Kingdom, they still retained the essential Anglo-Saxon identity. Further wave of British migrants were welcomed with open arms, while other Europeans of non-British origin were expected to shed their particular cultural identities and integrate with the host population. Australia, however, has been the first to acknowledge the increasing ethnic diversity created by more recent wave of immigration from other non-European countries, particularly from countries in Southeast Asia. With its present population around 23.5 million, the country now sees multiculturalism as being the heart of its society. On the other hand, New Zealand population of around 4.5 million is now predominantly European. Although immigration policy has focused more on the microstate of the South Pacific and most recently on migration flow of professionally qualified South African and East Asian. A prerequisite for selection for immigration is still proficiency in English. The business culture in Australia and New Zealand remains very much Anglo-Saxon in nature. However, the work environment tends to be more collaborative than in the UK or US, which means decision making can be rather slow and drawn out. The typical hierarchies are in place in most organizations, but since there is general distrust of authority, particularly of people who tend to flaunt it, a modest approach is preferred when colleagues are dealing with each other. They can, however, be more direct and critical than their British counterparts, although may not take so kindly towards outsiders joining the criticism. Humor is an indispensable ingredient of communication, with a preference of teasing others, particularly those whom they consider to be tall poppies, the term used to denote arrogant people who show off by talking frequently of their own accomplishment. So that's all for now. Thank you and see you in the next topic. Bye.